Of state leaders have been convicted of crimes as the last big corruption case was called Operation Tennessee Waltz.
FBI gave out about $150,000 in bribes to state lawmakers, including John Ford.
As well as continuing to help the department regain public trust in the aftermath of the TANF welfare scandal.
Former Mississippi Governor Phil Bryant released hundreds of text messages and emails with the goal to maintain his innocence in the misspent Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Funds investigation.
Edwards, who was always dogged by controversy and investigations, was finally convicted on federal charges and served nearly a decade in prison.
What if I told you that there's a U.S. state so steeped in corruption that even its governor ended up behind bars? And that's just scratching the surface. Which state is the most notorious in 2024? You'll be amazed. Welcome. Today, we're revealing the top 10 most corrupt states in the U.S. in 2024. From shocking bribes to secret deals, these stories will leave you stunned. And make sure to stay tuned because the state at number 1 has a corruption scandal you definitely don't want to miss. Curious if your state made the list? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more intriguing videos like this. Hit that like button if you enjoy this kind of content. Let's get started. Tennessee ranks at number 10 on the list of the most corrupt states in the United States due to a series of political scandals that have plagued the state in recent years. While Tennessee doesn't often grab headlines like some other states, it has a history of corruption at both the local and state levels, rooted in political power abuse and bribery. According to a report from the University of Illinois at Chicago, based on data from the U.S. Department of Justice, Tennessee averages 1.33 corruption convictions per 10,000 residents annually. This figure places the state in the top 10 most corrupt states, showing that corruption remains a persistent issue despite reforms and efforts to improve political integrity. One of Tennessee's most infamous corruption scandals is Operation Tennessee Waltz, an FBI investigation in 2005 that led to the arrest of several state legislators for bribery and corruption. Operation Tennessee Waltz was an undercover FBI operation where investigators posed as businessmen from a fictitious company, E-Cycle Management, seeking government contracts to recycle tech waste. Several state and local politicians accepted bribes in exchange for awarding favorable contracts and passing legislation for the company. The operation resulted in the arrest of multiple high-profile figures, including Senator John Ford, Senator Roscoe Dixon, Representative Chris Newton, and County Commissioner Bruce Thompson. Senator John Ford, one of Tennessee's most prominent politicians, was accused of accepting tens of thousands of dollars in bribes. Kentucky ranks number 9 on the list due to a long history of political scandals and corruption at both the local and state levels. The state has faced numerous cases of abuse of power, bribery, and fraud by government officials, contributing to its persistent reputation for political corruption. According to the University of Illinois at Chicago report, Kentucky averages 1.33 corruption convictions per 10,000 residents annually. This figure places Kentucky solidly in the top 10, with scandals often centering around political influence, election fraud, and the misuse of public funds. One of the most notorious corruption cases in Kentucky is Operation Bobtrot, a large federal investigation in the early 1990s that led to the arrest and conviction of several prominent state politicians for bribery and corruption. Operation Bobtrot was an FBI investigation into bribery within Kentucky's state legislature, focused on influencing regulations surrounding the horse racing industry and the Board of Physical Therapy. Lawmakers received bribes from lobbyists and businessmen in exchange for legislative favors that would benefit their business interests. In addition to Operation Bobtrot, Kentucky has dealt with recent corruption cases, such as election fraud in various local areas and misuse of public funds by municipal governments. These cases have contributed to the state's continued image of corruption. Montana ranks number 8, which might come as a surprise given the state's relatively small population. Nevertheless, Montana has experienced several high-profile corruption scandals, especially at the local and state levels, earning it a reputation for political corruption. According to the University of Illinois at Chicago report, Montana averages 1.37 corruption convictions per 10,000 residents annually. This places the state high on the list, particularly given its low population. Corruption in Montana often stems from a lack of oversight over government positions and abuses of political power. One of the most well-known corruption cases in Montana is the Tony Prite scandal. Although less famous nationally, this case had a significant impact on the state and exposed corrupt practices within the government. Tony Prite was a prominent figure in the Montana Department of Commerce and held influential positions within the state government. In 2005, he was accused of improperly using his government position to obtain financial benefits for himself. He was accused of misusing state funds for personal purposes, including awarding contracts to favored companies without following normal bidding procedures. In addition to the Tony Prite case, there have been several other corruption cases that have put Montana on the radar, especially at the local level, such as municipal governments and sheriff's departments. There have been multiple cases of bribery, abuse of power, and fraud. These cases have contributed to the perception of a culture of corruption within the state. Alabama ranks number 7 due to a history of political scandals, government corruption, and a culture of abuse of power at both the local and state levels. While the state faces economic challenges, political corruption in Alabama has been a significant issue that has repeatedly surfaced in various scandals. According to the University of Illinois at Chicago report, Alabama averages 1.37 corruption convictions per 10,000 residents annually. This high conviction rate places the state in the top 10, indicating widespread corruption at various levels of government. One of Alabama's most notorious corruption cases involves Robert Bentley, the former governor of the state, who became embroiled in a major scandal in 2017 that led to his resignation. Robert Bentley, governor of Alabama from 2011 to 2017, became entangled in a major scandal that began as sexual misconduct, but quickly expanded into allegations of abuse of power and corruption. Bentley was accused of using state resources and government staff to cover up his extramarital affair with his advisor, Rebecca Mason. Alabama has a long history of corruption cases, not limited to the Bentley scandal. In 2011, former state representative Mike Hubbard was convicted of accepting bribes and abusing his power in exchange for favorable legislation. Hubbard, who was the Speaker of the Alabama House of Representatives, was convicted of accepting illegal payments from businesses that he favored with his political influence. He was sentenced to 4 years in prison. Illinois ranks number 6 due to a long history of political corruption, with countless cases at both the local and state levels. The state, particularly Chicago, has become infamous for corrupt practices dating back to the early 20th century. Illinois, according to the University of Illinois at Chicago report, averages 1.42 corruption convictions per 10,000 residents annually. This places the state at the top of the list of corrupt states, with a significant emphasis on high-level political corruption. The city of Chicago alone has seen over 1,700 federal corruption convictions since 1976. One of the most shocking and infamous corruption cases in Illinois is that of former Governor Rod Blagojevich, who was arrested in 2008 and eventually convicted for a wide range of corruption offenses, including attempting to sell the vacant U.S. Senate seat that became available when Barack Obama was elected president. In 2008, Blagojevich was arrested by the FBI for attempting to sell or trade the Senate seat that opened up after Barack Obama was elected president. Wiretapped phone conversations revealed that Blagojevich thought the seat was worth something and sought financial benefits in exchange for appointing a successor. Illinois has a long history of corrupt politicians, including other former governors. In total, 4 of the state's last 9 governors have been indicted or convicted of corruption, including George Ryan, who was convicted in 2006 for racketeering and fraud in a scandal known as the Licenses for Bribes case, where he accepted bribes in exchange for trucker licenses during his time as Secretary of State. North Dakota ranks number 5, which is surprising given the state's small population and economy. However, North Dakota's high position on this list stems from a series of corruption cases that have impacted the state's political and economic systems, particularly related to the growth of the oil and gas industry. According to the University of Illinois at Chicago report, North Dakota has averaged 1.75 corruption convictions per 10,000 residents annually over recent decades, which is remarkable given the state's small population. These high figures point to deep-rooted corruption, particularly at the local and state government levels, often linked to the energy sector. One of North Dakota's most notable corruption cases involves the former leadership of the North Dakota Workforce Safety and Insurance, WSI, the state agency responsible for workers' compensation and unemployment insurance. In 2007, the WSI was embroiled in a major corruption scandal involving several top officials accused of abuse of power and accepting illegal benefits. The WSI's director, Sandy Blunt, was accused of embezzling state funds for personal purposes, such as awarding illegal bonuses to himself and other employees, as well as misusing public funds for lavish expenses. North Dakota's economy relies heavily on the oil and gas industry, particularly since the rise of shale gas extraction, fracking, in the last 2 decades. With this economic boom came a surge in political corruption, as companies and government officials became involved in unfair practices like bribery and permit granting for personal gain. While there haven't been any major scandals specifically surrounding the oil industry, numerous smaller cases of power abuse and bribery have affected this sector. South Dakota ranks number 4, despite being a smaller, less densely populated state. Its high position on the corruption list is explained by a combination of political scandals and the growing influence of the financial sector in the state, which has often faced little oversight or regulation. According to the University of Illinois at Chicago report, South Dakota averages 1.77 corruption convictions per 10,000 residents annually. This high conviction rate for a relatively small state points to deeply rooted corruption at the state level, particularly within the political and financial sectors. The most well-known corruption case in South Dakota is likely the EB-5 visa scandal, which came to light in the 2010s. This scandal involved the misuse of a federal program, the EB-5 Immigrant Investor Program, which offers foreign investors a fast track to U.S. visas in exchange for investments in American businesses. The EB-5 scandal revolved around the mismanagement of a program that allowed foreign investors to invest in projects in South Dakota, such as meat processing plants, in exchange for visas. However, the program was misused by government officials and businessmen to embezzle millions of dollars, with investments often not being used for their intended purposes. The EB-5 scandal sent shockwaves through the state and led to significant public and political outrage. The incident highlighted how vulnerable state institutions were to abuse and corruption, particularly in a state with relatively little oversight of complex financial transactions. The lack of regulation and transparency surrounding the program allowed officials to embezzle millions of dollars without it being immediately detected. Alaska ranks number 3 due to the strong influence of the oil and gas industry on politics, combined with several corruption cases involving high-ranking politicians. The state's small population and economic dependence on natural resources have created an environment where corruption can thrive more easily. According to the University of Illinois at Chicago report, Alaska averages 1.83 corruption convictions per 10,000 residents annually. This is one of the highest corruption rates in the United States, especially given the state's relatively small population size. Numerous scandals involving bribery, abuse of power, and kickbacks are responsible for this high average. The most well-known corruption case in Alaska is the Vico scandal, which came to light in the 2000s. This scandal involved the oilfield services company Vico Corporation and the involvement of several prominent politicians who accepted bribes in exchange for favorable legislation. Vico Corporation, an oil and gas services provider, was accused of bribing several state legislators in Alaska to influence legislation favorable to the oil and gas industry. The company paid kickbacks and provided other forms of illegal financial support to politicians in exchange for their support of legislation intended to benefit the oil industry fiscally. The Vico scandal highlighted how deeply entrenched the ties between politics and the oil and gas industry were in Alaska. The scandal shocked the state and led to a series of reforms and ethical checks aimed at preventing future corruption. The aftermath of the scandal left lasting damage to public trust in state politics and drew attention to how vulnerable Alaska is to corruption due to its dependence on the oil industry. Mississippi ranks number 2 due to a long history of political corruption, poverty, and power concentration in the hands of a few influential individuals. The state has experienced numerous scandals ranging from bribery to fraud, often involving state and local government officials. According to the University of Illinois at Chicago report, Mississippi averages 1.89 corruption convictions per 10,000 residents annually. This places Mississippi high on the list of the most corrupt states, and it indicates that political corruption is a significant issue that is widespread at both local and state levels. One of the most notorious corruption cases in Mississippi is the TANF scandal, in which millions of dollars from a federal assistance program for poor families, Temporary Assistance for Needy Families, TANF, were embezzled by high-ranking state officials and associates. This scandal came to light in 2020 and led to several arrests and public outrage. The TANF program is intended to provide assistance to the poorest families in Mississippi, but instead of the money reaching those in need, a large portion of the funds was embezzled by government officials and their allies. Around $77 million in federal funds was embezzled and spent on luxury expenses, private projects, and services unrelated to poverty relief. Mississippi also has a history of local and state officials being convicted for bribery, fraud, and abuse of power. From municipal officials accepting bribes for construction projects to sheriff's departments involved in fraud, corruption is deeply rooted in the state's political culture. Louisiana ranks number 1 as the most corrupt state in the United States due to a long history of political corruption that is deeply embedded in the state's culture. Louisiana's political and economic history is often intertwined with powerful families, political dynasties, and business interests, especially around the oil industry, making corruption a persistent problem. Louisiana has experienced countless scandals over the decades, ranging from bribery and fraud to abuse of power by high-ranking officials. According to the University of Illinois at Chicago report, Louisiana averages 2.0 corruption convictions per 10,000 residents annually, the highest of all U.S. states. This figure highlights the deeply ingrained culture of corruption at both the local and state levels. The numbers point to a widespread problem that has been difficult to eradicate over the years. One of the most infamous corruption scandals in Louisiana's history involves former Governor Edwin Edwards. Edwards, who served multiple terms as governor, 1972-1980, 1984-1988, 1992-1996, became a symbol of political corruption in the state due to his numerous scandals and eventual conviction for corruption. Edwin Edwards was a charismatic politician who remained popular in Louisiana, despite allegations of corruption throughout his terms in office. However, in 2000, he was convicted on 17 counts of racketeering, money laundering, mail fraud, and bribery. Edwards was involved in taking bribes in exchange for awarding casino licenses in the state. Louisiana has a long history of other corruption cases, ranging from local officials to state legislators involved in bribery and fraud. The oil and gas industry, as well as the gambling industry, often play a role in these scandals, as these sectors have historically been closely tied to the state's politics. Another notable scandal involves former Congressman William Jefferson, who was convicted of corruption in 2009 after being caught with $90,000 in bribe money in his freezer. That concludes our list of the top 10 most corrupt states in the U.S. in 2024. Which corruption case shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss another video. See you next time.